Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Storytime. In today's episode, we're going to look at how God used Moses to free his people, the Hebrews. From slavery in Egypt, we'll be looking at Exodus chapters 1 through 4. If you'd like to follow along with me, you can find this in your Bible or online at a website. Now, if you've been here before, then you know that we do things a little differently here at Storytime. Rather than just giving you the facts of the story, I want to take you into the story so that you can experience it for yourself. I also like to teach the big picture of the Bible by looking at each book individually, as well as how each book fits with the rest of the Bible. So if you're new here, then I invite you to join us each week as we grow our biblical literacy together. Let's dive right into it. Let's begin by asking some simple questions about the story that will help us understand it better. Who are the main characters in the story? What was their problem? How did they solve it? And finally, why should we care? Well, the main character in this story is Moses. Now, we don't meet him yet, but he's the one whom God will use to deliver his people from slavery in Egypt. Now, the problem is that there are these people called the Hebrews who have settled in Egypt, but now are being oppressed and enslaved by the Egyptians. To make matters worse, an Egyptian king has ordered that all Hebrew baby boys are to be killed at birth. This leads us to one of the most famous scenes in the Old Testament, where a Hebrew mother named Jochebed is hiding her baby son Moses for 3 months. Okay, so now let's fast forward a bit. One day when Moses was out taking care of his sheep, he sees a burning bush that is not being consumed by the fire. As he approaches the bush, God speaks to him and tells him to take off his sandals, because he is standing on holy ground. And then God gives Moses his mission, which is to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go so that they can worship God. But Pharaoh refuses. So God tells Moses that he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that God can display his power in bringing plagues upon Egypt. After that, God tells Moses that he will be known as the God of the Hebrews, and that Pharaoh's name will be remembered throughout all generations. Finally, God gives Moses some credentials so that the Israelites will know that he is sent by God. And then Moses goes back to Egypt. So let's stop here for a moment and think about what we just heard. First, we hear about the Israelites who are living in Egypt, but now are being oppressed by the Egyptians. Second, we hear about Moses, who is chosen by God to lead Israel out of slavery in Egypt. Third, we see that although Pharaoh lets the Israelites go, he later changes his mind. Fourth, we learn that God will use Moses to bring plagues upon Egypt until Pharaoh lets the Israelites go. And fifth, we notice that God tells Moses that he will be known as the God of the Hebrews, after this is all said and done. Now, the first thing that we need to pay attention to is the mention of the Israelites in the text. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, we read, "Then there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph." In Exodus chapter 2, verse 24, we read, "And God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." God looked upon the Israelites who were in Egypt, and God promised. Then, in Exodus chapter 3, verse 7, we read, "And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sorrows." Now, I could give you more examples, but you get the point. The word Israel, or Israelite, is mentioned quite often in these first 4 chapters of Exodus. Why is this important? Well, it's important because the theme of the book of Exodus is God delivering his people, Israel, from slavery in Egypt. Now, this raises a question. How does God usually act in human history? Well, if you've watched my videos on Genesis, you probably already know the answer to that question. But let me ask you directly, who usually initiates God's plans? Does he act on his own without anyone else? Or does he work through someone else to accomplish his goals? Now, if you think about the Adam and Eve story, or the Noah story, or the Tower of Babel story, or the Abraham story, I think you'll agree with me that God usually accomplishes his goals by working through someone else, and this story is no different. Moses is the person that God will choose to deliver Israel from slavery in Egypt. So let's take a closer look at Moses. In Exodus chapter 2, verses 11-12, we read, "And as he was tending the flock, he came upon a burning bush in the midst of a hedge. When he saw that the bush was burning but not consumed, then Moses said, I must now turn aside and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not consumed." Now as Moses was about to pass by, the angel of the Lord called to him and said, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here am I now." I don't want to get too deep into this right now, but I want to point out something very important here. Moses was not originally Hebrew, was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the Egyptian court. But even though Moses rejected his Hebrew identity earlier in his life, God still chose him to be the deliverer of his people. This will become clear to us as we continue to look at Moses' journey. Also, I want you to pay close attention to the way that God revealed himself to Moses. In Exodus chapter 3, verses 13-14, we read, "Moses said to God, 'Suppose I go to the children of Israel and say to them, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you." And they ask me, "What is his name? What shall I say to them?" Then God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" Now you might think that this is an odd thing for God to say, but he is telling Moses that he doesn't need to know God's name or anything else about God other than the fact that God sent him. In a sense, this is very similar to what Abraham was told when God asked him, "Who went? Whom dost thou call?" Abraham responded by saying, "I am the God of the living." Here God again identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In both of these instances, God was simply identifying himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he wanted these men to know that he was the God of promises. God reminds Moses of this again in Exodus chapter 6, verses 2-3. Now we understand that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the forefathers of the nation of Israel. And God reminds Moses of this so that he knows that God is faithful to his promises. Also, remember how I told you to pay close attention to how God revealed himself to Moses? Well, God reveals himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of promises. He wants this truth to be known throughout all the earth. Why is this important? Well, this will become clearer as we continue our study of Exodus. But for now, let's finish up by seeing how God delivers the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Now, I won't bore you with every single plague that God brought upon Egypt, but you can read those for yourself in Exodus chapters 7-12. But the important thing for us to see here is that God keeps his word. He tells Moses that he will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he can display his power, and that's exactly what happens. Finally, after the 10th plague, which was the death of every firstborn son in Egypt, Pharaoh lets the Israelites go. So let's think about this for a second. First, the Israelites were in slavery in Egypt. Second, God chose Moses to deliver his people. Third, God reminded Moses that he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Fourth, God brought plagues upon Egypt to display his power and to remind Pharaoh that God was in control. And fifth, Pharaoh finally lets the Israelites go. Now, what does this mean for us? Well, in a very real sense, this is a reenactment of creation. You see, in the beginning, God said that the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, but the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. In a sense, the world was in chaos and darkness, but God brought order out of chaos by speaking, and the same is true here. The Israelites are in chaos and darkness, but God brings them into the light by speaking. Also, in the creation account, we see that God made everything in 6 days and rested on the 7th day. Here we see that God brought 10 plagues upon Egypt over the course of about 2 weeks, which is roughly 14 days. And then he allowed the Israelites to leave on the 15th day. This is important because we see that God is a God who acts decisively in time. He doesn't just sit back and let things happen. No, he acts in history and accomplishes his goals through the actions of men. Well, that's it for this episode of Storytime. I hope that you enjoyed hearing the story of Moses, and if you did, please click the thumbs up button below. And if you haven't already subscribed, I encourage you to do so. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.